Well, it turns out today that we're all little Tomagos. A shock jump in inflation. And why? Electricity prices. Now, I say we're all little Tomagos because the big Tomago aluminium smelter in the Hunter Valley said this week it looks like closing because electricity prices, they're soaring. Plus, of course, the green energy that the government promised wasn't there. And now, don't all of us today feel that same pain from the Albanese government's disastrous green energy schemes? Today's inflation figures showed prices for the past 3 months jumped much higher than most experts predicted, from 2.1% to 3.2%. And the rise virtually rules out any cut in interest rates when the Reserve Bank meets next week. And what pushed that inflation rate so high? Well, a lot of it was because electricity prices rocketed a massive 9%. Now, this is, of course, the exact opposite of what this government promised you 3 years ago. Back then, it was going to cut your bills by $275, supposedly thanks to its brilliant green energy schemes.
Reducing power prices by $275.
By $275.
By 2025, $275.
$275 a year.
$275 a year.
How much more evidence do you need that this government has no idea how much its promise to cut emissions to net zero by 2050 will actually cost? No idea, no interest, nor does it have a clue on how it will all be done. You know, not one minister in this government has ever worked as a scientist or an engineer having to make things work. And doesn't it show? This shock inflation figure, I reckon it should really help Australians see straight through the Treasurer's terrific trick of seeming like he knows what he's doing, when he actually had to admit today that voters are really hurting after 3 years of this government.
Even with the very substantial and very sustained progress that we've made together on inflation, even with the progress that we've made on real wages, even with the progress we've made in the economy more broadly, a lot of Australians are still under pressure. I've acknowledged that. And that's reflected in the numbers today, Mr Speaker, as well.
It's not just reflected in these inflation numbers either. Last week's national accounts figures, they showed we're in real economic decline under this government. Despite all its massive spending to pump up the economy, despite its mass immigration, our national GDP, in blue in this graphic, well, it's kept slowing. But what you see in red is growth per person, how it actually feels to you. And on that measure, we are in recession. If you are feeling poorer, you are not alone. But Jim Chalmers, instead of taking blame for all this pain, today attacked the Liberals and Nationals instead with this transparently dodgy excuse for today's terrible inflation figures.
Inflation is higher than we'd like, but it is around half what we inherited from those opposite.
Well, no kidding, Sherlock. That inflation 3.5 years ago was actually because the Liberal Morrison government had spent madly during the pandemic lockdowns to keep businesses open and Australians at work. And at the same time, this very same Jim Chalmers was complaining that the Liberals still weren't spending enough, which makes me wonder how much higher would inflation have been had they listened to him. But back to this inflation, and especially this huge jump in power prices. Now, what is so frightening is that Chris Bowen, the Energy and Climate Change Minister, actually claims the Tomago disaster, a smelter wrecked by high power prices, simply proves we need even more of what's already killing our heavy industry. Even more of his wind and solar plants.
We need more of the cheapest and most reliable energy for our grid.
Chris Bowen, pants on fire, that bloke. Now, you should remember something whenever you hear Bowen talk so certainly that he is doing a perfect job and all his critics are idiots, and utter conviction he says that. Well, he showed that same conviction when he was Immigration Minister for 2 years under the Gillard Labor government, claiming he knew how to stop the boatloads of illegal immigrants, and that Tony Abbott, he was a fool. In fact, as you well know, Bowen let in nearly 400 boats. It took Abbott as Prime Minister to finally stop them. And now Bowen's there in another portfolio making an absolute pig breakfast, another one. Now, something Bowen somehow can't compute is that the more wind and solar we get, the more prices rise, as you have seen. He still doesn't get that even though most of our big smelters, which are huge users of electricity, most of them are at death's door now, demanding massive government handouts to stay in business. He doesn't get all that. Somehow Bowen has also missed the evidence that this link, that the more wind and solar you have, the higher your electricity prices tend to be, is true almost everywhere in the world. So instead, you just hear him rabbit on about how wind and solar are the cheapest and most reliable energy, when wind and solar are so obviously not reliable, so obviously the most unreliable power you can get. I mean, hello, they don't work when there's no sun and no wind. They only produce power when nature decides and not when you might actually need it. And that's also exactly one of the big reasons why they're also not the cheapest power. Because obviously they need backup. A whole second power system effectively to take over when the wind does die and the sun does dim. For instance, when I checked at breakfast this morning, wind and solar power was producing less than 10% of Australia's electricity. Where do you think the rest had to come from? Wind and solar plants also need a lot more poles and wires to join them all to the grid. And they're all over the country, so that costs billions more. And you again pay because poles and wires make up 45% of your electricity bills. Now, these are basic facts. Scientific facts, engineering facts, the Albanese government seems to be at war with. And that's why we are all locked into forever paying more for our power and for nothing. Because whatever we do here makes virtually no difference at all to our temperature. But it sure is making a difference to your cost of living, and for the painful worse.